to go first?
Yeah, let me I could make a number of comments. Let me try just to make a couple comments to this point. It's an extremely important set of issues. It's actually as old as the cab industry itself, and I, have seen these issues are often at the center of the work I do in a particular city. So just a couple comments. First of all, there are fluctuations in demand over the course of the week. So everyone knows Friday and Saturday night is heavier demand, Monday morning is less, you have a convention, you know where that's coming. Sometimes it's unexpected, much of it is on a regular basis. One of the strengths of the TNCs is that there is a core of full-time drivers who provide that baseline service, so you're out there 24/7. You have service out there 24/7. And then the drivers who work part-time tend to concentrate on the high-demand times. And so there can be, at least, there's the opportunity for adjusting supply to meet the changes in demand. Whereas if you had all full-time workers, they would be oversupplied at some points of the week and undersupplied at others. So what you end up with, and I think you were really alluding to this, is you have this core of full-time drivers who you really want to think about having this as a attractive, viable, full-time, long-term career kind of thing. It might not be 30, 40 years, but at least a good period of years. And then you have people who are supplementing their income, often in transition between jobs. They may be working and going to school. The taxi industry has always provided opportunities for people like that too. I know many people who drove a cab in the early 1970s in New York while they were going to school, for example, when it was hard to get other work. So you want to keep that balance. And the part-time driver who's working the Friday, Saturday night, who's transitional, is a different set of concerns in terms of the wage and benefit for them as opposed to the full-time driver. And I think a lot of the discussion, and Brian alluded to this, is for these contract employees, independent contractors, how do you make those good career jobs? So that's one piece. And then the other sort of comment that I wanted to make is that there can be plenty of money in the industry, but it doesn't mean that the driver gets it. So when medallion values or permit values are sky high, if the driver is the owner, is the holder of that permit or medallion, and this is what San Diego is doing, right? When he or she is the holder of that, they benefit when business goes up. When they're leasing it, then they don't necessarily benefit because it may just be that the lease price goes up. And so the structure of the regulation and the way the ownership system works is also very important, because there have been a lot of attempts by regulators to make sure that drivers get the money, the benefits, but depending on the structure, that may or may not happen. You could have lease caps, you could have owner drivers of the medallion or permit, there's various mechanisms. And so the structure of the system, of the regulatory system, needs to address that as well.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions, we're going to, Senator Bell.
Can you respond to the concern about basic civil rights with the American Disability Acts? And I want to point out something to you that wheelchair access isn't the only issue with the American Disabilities Act, okay? It's the access for people that are covered under the American Disability Act, which is of course, that has a wide range of disabilities. And you suggested some strategies. Is there work that you're undertaking that would expand that issue? You know, when the American Disability Act was created, they talked about narrowing the issue of what kinds of disabilities, but then it was decided that, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to cover all disabilities, and it's going to be a civil rights law, you know, just like any other civil rights law. And we have some great people in our state that worked on that. I'd just like to honor our Congressman Tony Coelho for being one of the authors of our American Disability Act, great member of Congress. And I know Congressman Coelho might have some opinion. It might be worth our while if we can contact him and find out what he thinks. So, I think that in hierarchy of types of issues on a regulatory framework, civil rights, to me, seems to be at the top, okay? And I want to know, I would put that at the top. I don't know if other people agree. I think civil rights has to be at the top. So how will these laws, these are laws, federal laws, and then we have our own state laws on it, how will they apply to looking at this regulatory framework we're talking about here?
Let me offer a couple of comments, and maybe Bruce or Susan can jump in. One of them is that the sorts of services that are provided in some cases, and especially smaller cities, are specialized services that are provided under contract by taxi operators. So that part of what keeps a taxi operation afloat is in part contract specialized transportation services that they might provide. And one of the concerns is that if there isn't a taxi operator to provide that, from where do you contract for specialized transportation services? So that's an important consideration. Now, one of the things is that if new services come into play, there are more operators in there. You actually can be able to provide more service at a lower rate. And then there's the issue of public accommodation.
But can you do it equally for somebody that's non-disabled and disabled? That's the issue. So you have to have an equal civil rights aspect to that.
Right. So the first part was about specialized transportation services to provide that. So like with public transportation, you can have requirements for, say, wheelchair accessibility, but you can also provide parallel paratransit services for people who have specialized needs. So I was speaking about those kinds of services there. Then there's a question of public accommodation. And where that line is again blurred by the title of the report is public and private. So certainly someone picking up a hitchhiker is different than someone providing sort of for-hire service. And the question as to what accommodation should be required is something that's often locally determined. So there are, some cities have requirements for a certain share of the fleet, the taxi fleet has to be wheelchair accessible, or the drivers have to have some kind of training. Others have very different sets of rules. And what we found is enormous variation across the taxi industry in that the way that those things are implemented. The question is then you can say, well, we could put regulations on the providers. We could extract funds from the providers and require public accommodation of specialized services. There are a variety of ways that places around the country implement those now, and there's no reason why a variety of approaches might be taken in cities around the state to address that fundamental issue, to ensure that there is public accommodation in this case and compliance with the civil rights components of the.
No, the public accommodation applies, the law on the public accommodation applies to public facilities in a special way in terms of our federal and state laws. And I'm talking about airports. You know, we want to have a system at the airports where people are treated equally in terms of their disability. How would, in the regulatory framework, we deal with that particular issue? Have you studied that issue of how you deal with, you know, somebody that has a disability that is trying to get a ride out of the airport or to the airport and so forth?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the issue, and it applies to airports or any other location, is how do you have a vehicle reasonably close by that's appropriately equipped, wheelchair accessible or other disability as appropriate in terms of the vehicle need, the vehicle equipped and the driver properly trained. So you have various needs that require driver training, it's not just a vehicle issue. We tend to focus on the vehicle mainly because of the expense involved and the special aspect of the vehicle involved. But the driver training and the driver skill and really the driver commitment to serving these sorts of trips is really equally important. And so what you need a vehicle and driver that's reasonably close when the customer calls. And the challenge to that is two things. One is the cost of providing, these vehicles cost more, and the driver training and the like. And the other is that the volume of trips for disabled trips and wheelchair accessible trips is lower than for the general population. So you don't have the density, the benefits that come with a dense demand. You can get a cab more easily in downtown San Francisco than in an outlying area because of the density of demand. You have a vehicle close by. So the two things I would offer on this to think about, one is to have a good source of revenue, and many cities have adopted a per trip fee or a per vehicle fee to generate revenue, because these, to pay for the incremental cost that is associated with providing the service. And the other is to take all the different sources of these sorts of trips. So it's the non-emergency medical, it's general taxi demand, it's the ADA paratransit demand. There are often programs for seniors and other types of programs like that. Take all of that demand and the vehicles that serve it and aggregate it, so that then you're more likely to have a vehicle close by. You're not, if you split it up into all these segments, then you sort of defeat your own efforts in doing that. And so to bring it together, and San Francisco is a good example of a city that has done this. I was in Reno recently. They've done this very effectively, and in fact, they have Reno is very different because it's small, but they're able to actually just operate that without any subsidy because of that aggregation of trips. And so in sort of trying to think about it, it's not to get everyone to serve every kind of trip. It's to make sure you can cover the trip, you have a group of vehicles that are close by, and that you have the technology, and technology has a lot of things to offer here, to then link up the passenger when they need a trip and the vehicle and the driver.
All right, I'm just going to say this again, that wheelchairs aren't the only disability. It's a broad category of law applied to the, quote, the American for Disabilities Act. So we have to look at that from the standpoint, we have an established civil rights law that covers a lot of people in our country, and it should be looked at that way, not just particular issues with wheelchairs, although that's important too.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
We're gonna move on to our next panel. Thank you very much. Did you want to ask a question, Senator Morrell?
Please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I was down here at this end. Bruce, could I ask you 4 quick questions here, because I'm trying to get a handle on your study. A lot of information here, and I'm trying to make sure that I clearly understand it. You have unlevel playing field on one of your charts, and a couple of things would be driver safety, government background checks, whereas TNCs do their background checks. Which are you saying is the safest?
Right, so that is the sort of the $64 question, is that we don't have the data, and Brian had alluded to this. Okay. We don't have the data to really answer that question. And one of the things that would be very helpful in this area is to have studies which go into that, both from a background check standpoint and then the ongoing monitoring and how that can provide for safety as well.
Okay, well, so we don't have that question. Price set by regulation, taxis, and in TNCs, they set their prices. And then on the back of one of your pages, it says you want to prevent abuses of monopoly power. So who are you directing that comment towards so far as pricing and monopoly power? Would that be towards the taxis or the TNCs?
Well, I would just, it's a general comment.
But you are directing that to one of those two, I would assume.
Well, the taxi fares currently are set by regulation, so it's not really directed on that side, as long as that's the case. There's the potential, as in any market, and I'm not directing this to a particular company or segment, but there's always the potential, if one company gets a large share of the market, that they exercise market power in economist terms, in pricing and in other respects as well. And so this is a general comment in thinking about a regulatory framework and approach. Is generally the solution to this is to take steps to ensure that there are multiple competing firms, so none of them can bring that dominance to bear.
I think there's one other thing I want to add to that, is that there's 2 reasons why the entry and the prices fit together. Is that when you limit the number of vehicles that can come into a market, as is often the case with taxis, you then have the potential for abuses in pricing unless you also set price. Okay, so if you're able to have multiple competing firms that don't have barriers to entry and can set price, that allows normal market behaviors to function. So if you set one, you then have to set the other, which is the case in the street hail world, right? You establish what the prices are, you establish barriers to entry. When both of those things vary, you don't necessarily have to have one or the other, because if prices go up, people can come into the market. If you limit what can come into the market, prices go up, people are exercising monopoly power.
And we want market competitiveness, so those
Right.
prices are reduced for the rider. At the end of the day, that's the people we are here to serve.
Right, and that's why I mentioned in my remarks, it's very important that there be limited barriers to entry on the TNC side, that it's possible that other firms can emerge to compete with the existing ones. If one were to attain sort of monopoly dominance, it then would raise a whole other set.
One last question, because and then this will be it for right now. So are you trying to get the taxis, or I should say the TNCs, to have equal regulation on the same par as the taxis, or are you trying to get less regulation for the taxis so they're more competitive with the TNCs?
So that's a really important point here. This is a National Academies panel that we're trying to provide advice to regulators to think about how to do these issues. What we've said is there is benefits to making sure that across various dimensions, it doesn't say that all of the regulations are equal, and that's why we try to differentiate street hail versus advanced reservation, but that regulations be applied equally. We don't weigh in on whether state is best, region is best, local is best. We don't weigh in on that, because what we try to do is lay out in the report what are the pros and the cons of the various approaches. We are not making specific regulations, specific recommendations about how regulations should be implemented. We are recommending that there be consistency across the regulatory framework, whether that be at a higher level or lower level, but that there is benefits to that consistency in the regulation.
Everybody good? Okay, thank you very much. We're going to bring on our commissioner from the Public Utilities Commission, Leanne Randolph, forward. Thank you for being here. We're going to also ask Eva Chung from the San Francisco International Airport, and Annette Williams from the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, and Bob Lockhart with the Manila San Jose International Airport to come forward. But we have Commissioner Randolph will go first to talk about the charge that the legislature voted a few years back to instruct the PUC to come up with a regulatory framework for the TNCs in the state of California. Am I correct in that? And I understand the PUC is working toward that, and you're here to talk about that and give us maybe an update.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Hueso, Chairman Bell, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm going to just give a brief overview of where we started and where we are, and what we're working on in terms of our next steps. So I'll start out by saying that the history of this issue has evolved a fair amount in a very short period of time, in the sense that when the commission originally looked at this issue starting in 2012, before I came to the commission, the companies were arguing that they shouldn't be regulated at all. They were arguing that they were merely pieces of technology, and they were not, and that they were accepting donations, and they were not working for profit. And so things have evolved since then. In 2013, the commission adopted its first decision on TNCs that defined them as companies that use online-enabled apps to connect passengers using their personal vehicles in a prearranged way. The decision set forth various requirements for TNCs. We require each company to obtain a permit from the commission, require the companies to engage in criminal background checks for each driver, obtain driver records, establish a driver training program, and implement a zero-tolerance policy on drugs and alcohol. And relevant to our discussion earlier, we require the TNCs to report a significant amount of data on an annual basis. They have to submit reports detailing the number of drivers found to have committed a violation or have a suspended license. They need to provide us with reports about accidents or other incidents that involve a TNC driver, the cause of the incident, the amount paid, if any, in compensation to any party. They must report the average and mean number of hours each driver drives for the TNCs. They must report the number of rides requested and accepted by the TNC drivers within each zip code where the TNC operates, and data on rides that were declined, which is important in looking at issues of equal access to neighborhoods that may receive less service. The TNCs are also required to provide data on requests for rides from individuals with disabilities and whether or not those rides were actually responded to. We continue to work on collecting the data and working on analyzing the data. The commission earlier this year did fine Rosier, one of the TNCs, $7.6 million for failing to follow the reporting requirements. So we do take them very seriously, and we expect them to be followed. The 2013 decision assumed that the commission would undertake a phase 2 and analyze some of the issues that were not dealt with in phase 1. And so when I started at the commission approximately 1 year ago, I was assigned this proceeding and embarked on addressing phase 2. We currently have a proposed decision out right now that is scheduled and we're anticipated to be voted on at the March 17th commission meeting. So I'll give you a brief overview of what's in that phase 2, but I'll caveat that with it has not yet been voted out by the commission. It is a proposal from myself and the judge on this case, and it may end up being changed as a result of the commission's review of the decision. It adds some additional requirements. It requires annual inspection of vehicles, either annually or 50,000 miles, whichever comes first. It requires the inspections to be performed by Bureau of Automotive Repair licensed facilities. Currently, those inspections can be done by the companies themselves. We currently, as I mentioned, do require driver training, but phase 2 would add a little more detail about what they're required to train their drivers on. It's not just being friendly and customer service, it's on federal, state, requirements in terms of following our rules and following the rules of the road. We also took a look at the issue of companies that transport unaccompanied minors. There are a couple of companies that market themselves to transport unaccompanied minors, and those are usually require a significant amount of pre-arrangement time, usually 24 hours ahead of time. The parent can arrange for the transportation of an unaccompanied minor. And we do require the drivers who transport unaccompanied minors to be registered with the Trust Line Service, which includes fingerprinting. We added some requirements on trade dress. Currently, the vehicles are required to identify the TNC they're driving for in the front. We are now requiring it in the back as well, which was an issue some of the airports had raised with us. We allow leased vehicles to be used by drivers. Under both the decision and the legislation mandating insurance requirements, it refers to personal vehicle. And we recognize that not everyone owns their vehicle. They lease, many people lease vehicles. And so we wanted to clarify that so long as it is their personal vehicle, so long as they have control over it, they get to use it for their personal purposes, they have the ability to drive for other companies, we would consider that to be a personal vehicle. We are proposing in phase 2 to allow for fare splitting by passengers in TNCs, which is the carpooling practice that a lot of companies are currently engaged in. And we have not yet tackled the issue of fingerprinting for non-unaccompanied minor TNCs. The reason for that is we did not directly ask that question in our scoping memo, and we have not received a sufficient amount of evidence and information from the companies about what their current background check practices are and what the pros and cons of doing an additional fingerprinting requirement would be. But we do think this is an important issue to tackle. So our decision includes direction to, for us to issue issue a ruling in the next 60 days after the decision is adopted, open up that issue and take some evidence on that and address that issue. I would, to Chairman Hueso's point, I think this is an area that would benefit from comprehensive legislative approach. But I will say we also have benefited from some of the bills that the legislature has passed and the direction that it has provided us. The insurance bill was extremely helpful. The original Phase 1 decision required the TNCs to participate in the pull notice program, and so Assemblymember Cooper's bill that allowed companies to participate in the pull notice program even for independent contractors was very helpful in ensuring that that additional safety measure was available. So our next steps are SB 541 requires the commission to analyze our transportation program, figure out what our capabilities are under our current scheme, and figure out what our needs are into the future. And so we are working on that, getting that study and analysis underway. Internally, administratively, we're reorganizing our transportation enforcement branch slightly. We're moving it to a new division called the Consumer Protection and Enforcement Division. And there will be we're recruiting currently for a new director for that division, and that will allow us, the new director, to come in and take an initial look, even ahead of our SB 541 analysis, of what our current staffing is and what kind of interim changes might be necessary in doing that work. So that's basically the overview of where we've been and where we're going.
Have you considered, have you looked at how many TNCs are on the market, for example, and looking at potentially capping that number? Is that something you're looking at?
We have not tackled that issue yet. I mean, I will tell you that traditionally under our charter party carrier regulatory scheme, we don't cap the number of vehicles. But one of the interesting challenges of this proceeding is that the facts change and the market changes. And so in moving forward with looking at things like fingerprinting, looking at what we would do in Phase 3 of our proceeding, I think we are recognizing that we need to be flexible in issues that we are willing to look at and we are willing to analyze, and we need to...
You're looking to establish, okay, along that lines, if you're not going to do that, you're looking to establish rules requiring inspections of vehicles?
Right, so Phase 2, the proposed decision to be voted on next month does require, we already require the companies to do inspections of vehicles, and we are adding additional requirements that it be done by a certified facility.